All right, so in this tutorial, we'll be looking at the formation of the small blind limp and the big blind check. So small blind limp range here, it's the bottom of the ranges is 48%, 49% range, and it's about 18.72% of the range. The small blind limps a lot of the lower end of their opening range, a bunch of hands like Queen 2, Jack 3, 10 4, 4 3, and some of these suited hands. Why does a small blind limp a bunch of these hands? It's because when you have some of these medium suited hands, if you open, you get 3-bet. It's not a great situation. So say, for example, we open to the 3x and you get 3-bet to, say, for example, 9. These suited and connected hands tend to be very close to 0 EV, if not folding out completely. So for that reason, there is some benefit in limping some of these hands. If you limp and then your opponent goes for the raise, so for example 3.5, you can fairly easily call that raise with some of these suited hands such as Queen 9, Jack 9, 7 6, 7 5. And conversely, some of these hands at the bottom, fairly easy to limp and then fold to the raise, and you don't really want to fold yourself. You have a little bit of equity in the pot with some of these weaker hands. So say, for example, like a 10-4, Jack 4's got about 0.02 BB, or 2 big blinds per 100 hands. Now, obviously, this weaker limping range, you're going to have to defend that with some of the stronger hands. So a lot of the pocket pairs are going to be limping at some frequency. Same, for example, ace king offsuit. Now, some of the suited hands, such as the ace 9, ace 8, these hands will always go for a raise. King 10, queen 10, jack 10 suited, king jack suited. These hands will always go for a raise because there's a significant amount of benefit in denying equity, and essentially because your opponent would 3-bet any hand that's stronger than those hands. This means that a hand like ace 9, king jack, king 10, queen 10, when they make top pair, their kicker is essentially a nut kicker, or near a nut kicker in the single raise pot. So a hand like king 10, sure, you lose to king queen offsuit, ace jack, king jack offsuit. And similarly, ace 9, ace 8 will lose to ace jack and ace 10, but there's a significant amount of ace king and ace queen, etc., which will be 3-bet. And so in the 2-bet pot, you know that your hand is very close to top pair, essentially top kicker in that particular pot. And then similarly, limping, and then say, for example, you face a raise, these hands, ace 9, ace 8, king 10, queen 10, these hands are strong enough to go for a limp and then 3-bet semi-bluff. These hands work really well in the raising range and not super well in the calling range. So you'd much rather limp and then call hands like this, these offsuit broadways, these suited king suited aces, than having to limp and then call a hand like ace 8, ace 9, which if you look at it, if you limp and then your opponent goes for the raise and then you call, you'll end up being dominated a fair amount of the time. Look at all their ace 10 through to ace king, and ace king through to ace 10. So if you've got a hand like ace 9, ace 8, and the top pair comes, you're actually going to be dominated a good chunk of the time. So it's allocating the hands into the range which most benefits. And there's a small amount of EV difference in these particular cases. While there's a small amount of EV difference in the simulation, in reality, that EV difference is going to be fairly significant. So a hand ace 9, ace 8, king 10, queen 10, jack 10 will much rather raise than limp, because if they limp and then face a raise, you'll end up on the bad side of the domination. But if you raise and then they call, you'll end up on the good side of the domination. Important to understand why some of these hands do the things that they do. All right, so let's take a quick look at some post-flop spots as some examples. But before we do that, we'll look at the raising range in particular for the big blind. So the big blind, after the small blind goes for the limp, the big blind will be raising a lot of the big pocket pairs. Most pocket pairs from 5s up will be raising at some frequency. 4s, 3s, and 2s, low frequency, but pocket 9s through to aces pretty much always raises. All the sort of broadways are going to raise. Ace queen, ace jack, ace 10, very high frequency. Ace 5, ace 4, very high frequency. All the suited connectors and a lot of the suited gaps. And then the bluffs and semi-bluffs come from this bottom left corner, basically offsuit junk, which if you look at it, you raise, you get some folds with certain stronger hands, and then you end up dominating some of these weaker hands like the 10-6, 9-6, 6-4, with the king 6 and queen 7, you're actually going to dominate some chunk of the calling range, as well as folding out some of the hands that are slightly stronger than you by going for this raise over the limp. Very briefly, if you do face a raise, this is what the calling range looks like, and then so there's a 3-bet range. And 3-bet size in the limp 3-bet range itself is usually going to be slightly on the bigger size, around 14, can't go up to 16, and then you can drop down to around 11, 10, 12. Totally up to you what you want to use. But say, for example, you limp and then raise 4x to 14. This is what the calling range will look like. Basically the pocket pairs and broadways. Then you're basically playing a 3-bet pot, which looks fairly similar to a big blind versus button situation. All right, so let's take a look at the limp and then check. If you notice all the checks, a bunch of very weak hands. And as a result, if we look at post flop, here this is a 16 different flops, just some examples that we can look at. If we sort it by equity, overall you've got a bunch of different examples here, and the equity is fairly large for the small blind. And that makes sense because the big blind will just check back a lot of the free hands and try and see a free flop. But as a result, the small blind is going to have a significant equity edge, and then as a result, the big blind is going to be folding pretty often. So let's take a look at one of these flops. Say, for example, a king, king, jack flop. Let's pull that up. Here, king, king, jack, betting one big blind very frequently. And if you notice, across all these flops, one big blind is a very frequent size. Going for like over bets on the flop is usually not necessary. Betting small is sufficient with a wide range. Betting small with a wide component of the range is good to just deny equity. Now, if you look at the amount of hands that will fold out of the big blind is going to be massively overfolding, because in a lot of these check down lines, the big blind just has no chance of winning. Say, for example, here, the big blind sitting with 6, 3, 5, 2, and you do get it checked down. Here, look at how frequently the big blind will be checking back. A lot of these hands just aren't worth bluffing. Just check it down. Say, for example, like this. Say, for example, it goes 2 and then 4. In this situation, small blind can check down a bunch of queen high, and the big blind just has to give up a lot of these sort of 6 high, 5 high type hands. There's too many hands that can be used as a bluff, and so the big blind just has to give up. Otherwise, the big blind will be over bluffing. Bet, for example, and queen high will call as a bluff catcher here. It's king, king, jack, so it's essentially very similar to ace high in relative strength. All right, let's take a look at more of a board that's slightly better for the big blind, at least relatively, 10-5-3. The reason why a board like 10-5-3 is good for the big blind is because the big blind, if you look at their pre-flop range, they're checking back a lot of the low cards. And so here, when there's 2 or 3 low cards on the flop, the big blind will be favored. Not necessarily in terms of overall equity, but enough that the big blind will be pretty happy with the result. Check, for example, here the big blind is going to be betting at a fairly high frequency, 44%. If you look at the rest of the betting frequencies after the small blind checks, the big blind across these 16 different flops will be checking back at around 70% frequency, but the boards that are better for the big blind, obviously the big blind will be betting more frequently. Small blind checks, big blind goes for, say, for example, a bet here, and then the small blind can go for some raises and some folds. The small blind bets themselves, the big blind will still be folding pretty frequently, but here, because the board is so good for the big blind, betting half pot gives you an alpha of about 33%, so 0.5 over 1 plus 0.5, so 33%. So here, in fact, the big blind is not necessarily overfolding, just because all the 5s and 3 type hands have actually hit the board for the big blind. So pretty good board for the big blind here. Check, bet, and say, for example, you go for a check raise, the big blind will be pretty happy to continue with all of those pairs. So in these limp pots, say, for example, we do get a check down line here, and this 10-5-3, check, check, 8, bet half pot, and king high is calling slash very close to indifferent. Similarly, ace high is calling slash very close to indifferent. Some of his weak pairs as well. Check, face a bet. Similarly, king high type hands, ace high will be calling. That's on an unpaired board, and then where the board pairs, so for example, we get the 5 here, check, half pot bet, and then similarly, a lot of the king highs is calling. So whether the board pairs or not tells you like how wide you should call, and if the board comes a flush, for example, it's not quite as relevant in a lot of these check down lines because the flush only represents 3% of the range. So similarly, plenty of the ace high will call. It will impact the kickers slightly. So with a flush blocking kicker, you would be preferring to call those hands. But here the ace is not particularly relevant just because the big blind will essentially be betting all of their ace flushes at a very high frequency or checking back an ace with the ace of spades. All right, so let's take a look at one more in a little bit more depth. So for example, we get let's go with a queen 5-2. Queen 5-2, a little bit in the middle for both players. The queen is going to be good for the small blind, but the 5 and the 2 are going to be good for the big blind. Bet one big blind, and the big blind has enough resources to defend on this board. This 2 hits basically all of these 2x which would have checked back pre-flop. This 5 hits a lot of this 5x that would have checked back pre-flop. So there's a lot of resources here for the big blind to defend. Say for example, half pot, which hands go into the half pot bet? A lot of sort of these top pair, middle pair, weak pair. One big blind, call. Say for example, we get a 10, offsuit 10, pot size bet with like top pair, half pot size bet with sort of these middle pairs. Let's take a look at the pot size bet. 2 pairs going for some raising. Getting it on the turn here, all in is 2 pair plus. Pot size bet, so 4 big blinds. Call 5 for, an 8 for example, and then just rip it with the Jack 9 made straight. 2x pot with some of these 2 pair hands. Go for a 7. It's a pot size bet with the over pairs. Top pairs going for a half pot bet. Now we are going to run into a fair amount of 2 pairs in limp pots just because there's so many different ways you can make 2 pairs, especially against in the big blind. So big blind will be, especially if you go bet like this, we'll be making a fair amount of 2 pair hands just because of all the offsuit combinations of 2 pair. So you do have to watch out, but top pair will often just go for 3 streets of value on a lot of these boards. Let's take a look at something that's a little bit better for the small blind. Ace Jack 7 here. Big blind doesn't really have too much Ace Jack, or any Ace Jack for that matter. Here, a little bit of Ace Jack there. Obviously, they're going to have Jack 7 suited and Jack 7 offsuit, pretty good frequency. Ace 7 offsuit, Ace 7 suited, pretty good frequency, but not a whole amount of Ace Jack. And the small blind hits a fair amount of this Ace X and Jack X combination. Go for this half pot bet. Big blind without sufficient resources to defend will just be overfolding. Reason why overfolding is because if the small blind takes the check down line, the big blind will just have too many bluffs on the river to be able to actually justify betting too many of those weak hands, and so the big blind will actually have to give up in the check down line. And so the EV for the small blind to check some of these very weak hands is actually pretty high. So some of these unmade hands with a 5-2, if you look at the EV, it's 0.48, even though 5-2 is just an air ball, meaning in the check down line, the small blind can use this hand as a bluff, but the big blind cannot. And so the small blind will actually be able to profitably bluff the big blind at some stage using the 5-2 and similar type hands. If not, here just on the flop. Half pot bet, overfolds. Let's say, for example, you get a 4 of hearts. You get some 4x pot with the 3 of a kinds of 7s, 2 pair with that ace jack that the big blind doesn't have. 4x pot, basically nuts. Weaker 2 pairs are going to call you because of the blocker effects, not necessarily because they beat any of the hands that are for value here. And then, say for example, 2 on the river, relative brick, just rip it in with the ace jack, pretty happily for 2x the pot. So, and then these 2 pair hands are going to be indifferent and slash calling you based on the blocker effects. So you can be very aggressive on some of these boards where the big blind doesn't have that top 2 pair. So with the top 2 pair yourself, you can just go ham. Pocket aces, pocket jacks can sometimes go for the limp raise. Similarly, ace jack can sometimes go for the, not limp raise, check raise. Here, say for example, check, face pot size bet, These ace jack hands and these pocket jacks, pocket sevens are just going to go for a very big check raise here, 2x pot. Check raise, pretty massive, and then brick on the river, jam the river. So yeah, do try to get all the money in when you've got a very strong hand. You need to find a way to do it. And the second pot ratio is very deep, so don't be afraid to go for like massive raise sizes. That's totally fine, especially if your hand is just unbeatable compared to the opponent's range. If you have the mortal nuts, just go for it. Get all the money in across as many streets as you can by betting really big. Okay, and then hands that are a bit weaker than that, so it's ace king and ace queen, that will run into sort of 2-pair hands. Then you can just pot it, get a call for weaker top pairs, middle pairs, brick river, pot the river again. So for example, you got ace king, ace queen, ace 10, ace jack. Sorry, ace jack is 2-pair, ace 10, ace 9, half pot or pot size bet. Here, for example, with ace king, just go for a pot size bet. Get called by plenty of weaker pairs. So obviously 2-pair is going to call you, and if you get jammed on, then you're going to be indifferent with your ace king there. And even some of the 2-pairs are going to be not really liking it. Half pot bet with some of the weaker hands like the ace 10. Get called by some more middle pair hands. You're going to get raised by a lot of these 2-pair hands. And then if you have ace jack plus, you're just going to rip it in yourself. All right. So that was a little bit of a deep dive into some of the preflop and postflop scenarios for this particular formation, the small blind versus big blind limped pot. Hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one.